Hello and welcome to another episode of Adventures in Local Marketing. I'm your host, Christian Bannister, Head of Marketing at BrightLocal. On today's episode, we are getting more technical than we ever have on this podcast, because I'm talking with Cindy Krum, CEO and founder of Mobile Moxie. Cindy is one of the leading experts in mobile SEO, but her expertise doesn't end there. She's always on the forefront in really understanding what Google is trying to do, and then how that might impact an SEO strategy. Now, if technical SEO is not one of your strong points, don't worry, it's not one of my strong points either. But Cindy has an amazing way of explaining very technical aspects of Google's crawling and indexing in a way that makes it really accessible and easy to understand. And I tell you what, I learned a whole heap on this episode, not just about mobile SEO, but also around semantic search and entity understanding. Cindy's argument is that it's all connected. Google is already using mobile-first indexing. And if mobile isn't really a key part of your SEO strategy, that doesn't really matter. It's something that you need to be aware of and acting on. And Cindy's going to take us through all of the things you need to know and how to future-proof your SEO strategy. So let's get to it. Let's get technical. Hi, Cindy. Thank you so much for joining me on Adventures in Local Marketing.
Thanks for having me.
So we're going to be covering mobile marketing, mobile SEO and entity understanding. And if I'm honest, these are areas that I'm not that super knowledgeable about. So I'm really looking forward to learning more. But I wanted to kick things off by talking about your company, Mobile Moxie. So what exactly does Mobile Moxie do?
Yeah, so Mobile Moxie is a company I started in 2008. And it's two things. It's a consultancy where it's smaller than an agency, and we don't have project managers. You always go directly to an expert. And we do a lot more of coaching of teams with internal in-house SEOs. So we do a little bit less of the worky work and a lot more of the coaching and directing and training, and then verifying work. And then we also sometimes get kind of emergency clients who are like, we have this thing and it's related to mobile first indexing and we need it fixed right now. Can you drop everything and do that? We do those too. So that's part of the business. And then the other part of the business is the SaaS tool set that we have. It is meant for SEOs primarily. There are tools that are meant for SEOs, ASO, which is app optimization, and then ones that are made for conversion and development. So 3 tools.
Okay, great. And what sorts of clients are coming to you for, I guess, both sides of your business, the consultancy and the SaaS side?
Yeah, so on the consultancy, since we've been around for so long, we've been fortunate enough to get to work with really big international, well-known brands around the world, which is so exciting. And then we also work with some smaller local companies too. And some, local companies with lots of stores and companies you've never heard of. It's quite the variety, but we do like, we prefer large enterprise sites because there's usually more success actually, because they usually have budgets and developers, whereas the smaller you get, the less they have in terms of budget and development and stuff like that. So that's the consulting side. And then on the SaaS side, it's everybody. The tools are super affordable. It's like the lowest price is $30 a month, which is not a big deal for most companies. And it's for developers, SEOs, UX experts, app SEOs, and just general marketers. They're pretty easy to use. You don't really have to understand a lot about SEO to get a lot of great information out of the tools.
Okay, cool. What sorts of insights are the tools going to be telling me if I was a marketer who's really wanting to learn more about mobile performance?
The tool that's probably most relevant for this audience is the SERPerator. And what it does is it lets you choose a location anywhere in the world, down to the address, like the street address, and choose a phone and then do a search query, and you get the actual real result you would get as if you were standing there. So that's the basic tool, and we've had that one for a while. We've just recently launched our data view, which actually parses the mobile search result, pulls out everything in there, not just the organic stuff, but the stuff that Google conveniently doesn't count, like knowledge graph. And it tells you the traditional order and then the actual order. And it also tells you the pixel height and the percent of the page that it's taking. And then we're working on something where it's going to add up the percent of the page that you could get in a blue link versus what you really just can't. And we come up with this thing called a Moxie score that tells you basically how are you doing, because we also let you see not just your website, but all of the stuff you could rank in a SERP. And we kind of let you create a profile where you say, this is me, this is me, this is me. So we can capture website, Facebook page, LinkedIn page. If you have articles on another site and they're showing, you can just claim them. And then forever we know that's you. And so you can say how much of the page is your stuff, not just your website, but your stuff taking. It includes map packs. And then we also have a local function that's a bit like a local Falcon, but not quite, because you just drop the pin and then we do it in 3 radiuses around it, but we parse the whole thing there too. And in the data view, we do it over time. So you can set it to go weekly, monthly, whatever, auto grab the screenshots and parse all that data.
Wow. So if you're a marketer who really wants to know how you appear on a mobile anywhere in the world, this tool is going to give you as close to a real world idea as possible then.
It is a real world. It's Google thinks we're phones. Shh.
Yes. Well, as long as no one from Google's product team listens to this episode, I think you should be fine. Brilliant. So you said you founded Mobile Moxie back in 2008. And that was 1 year after the iPhone. So obviously, mobile marketing before the iPhone, I can imagine, was pretty crappy. I mean, like, I've used those sorts of phones that you had where it was just like some strange app that you used to connect to the internet. And it was a very dumbed down, watered down version of being online. So when you formed Mobile Moxie, what would you say mobile marketing and mobile SEO was like back then?
Yeah, so I think you might have the year a little bit wrong. I think the iPhone launched in 2006.
Oh, I got it wrong.
But it was still very new, and most people didn't have them right away. Yeah, I started the company in 2008, but I actually started doing mobile SEO in 2005. So definitely still before the iPhone. So it's still a relevant question. And when I started doing mobile SEO, the first kind of big drama in my public life was this heckler that came, and it was a session about M-dots, and he was like selling M-dot. Like he was trying to sell M-dots as a separate domain or make money somehow. I don't know. He was a spammer. But he heckled me because I was talking about using one page and how search engines would probably, if you can make one page that's super light and fast, that works on desktop and mobile, that's better because you don't split your SEO value between an M-dot page. Or no, it was .mobi. I'm wrong. It's old enough that he was selling. That's what makes sense. He was selling .mobi domains. That's what it was. And he was interrupting and stood up in the audience, and he actually got kicked out of the conference. But anyway, it was our .mobi domain's gonna make it, and I was saying no, and I was explaining what became style sheets, what became responsive design, right? Like I was saying, use style sheets and one page. And now we have a word for it. It's called responsive design. But at the time, there wasn't even a word for it. So it was a lot of me reading mobile development blogs. And I'm not a developer, but I could kind of read and be like, that's not right. Like what they're telling the mobile developers to do might work for mobile development and make their life easier, but it's making the search engine's life much, much harder. And so I started trying to kind of bring the two together and say, yeah, lots of mobile development blogs tell you to do this, but it's going to hurt. And it was even simple things like doing meta refresh and doing 302 redirects. Everything mobile was 302 at a time when Google really only honored 302s for 30 days, and then things would fall off a cliff.
Yeah.
So it was Indiana Jones kind of stuff, like just like digging through the weeds and looking for treasure that was like, here's the problem, this is what they're doing, and it's messing everything up. So it was fun.
Yeah, I can imagine. It's not often that you get new frontiers in online marketing, really. So mobile definitely feels like one that was an area that needed to be explored, and really interesting to know that what people were actually doing, wasn't actually the right approach. I guess responsive websites really kind of unlocked the ability to kind of do what you had proposed. Were there any other pivotal moments in mobile marketing since you've started?
Yeah. So even when people were still talking about .mobi and I was talking about responsive design before it had a name, the next main pivot point wasn't responsive design. There was a middle point, and it was MDOTs.
Yes, of course. Yeah.
And Google was suggesting MDOTs, and Google came out with bidirectional annotation to make MDOTs share your SEO value. But then everyone messed it up. Like, it's kind of like Google kept trying to solve problems but create new ones. And then they would basically bring the problem back, but in their form, because they said do MDOTs, and then they said do responsive, but responsive people messed up too. So they said do AMP, which was essentially an MDOT, but it was with special code. It was a thin, light, separate mobile page. And then they're like, oh, wait, no, that didn't make sense. We're going to make AMP for everything, and we're going to speed things up on our side. Everyone was trying, and everyone was figuring out, including Google. But it set the tone that continues today, where Google says one thing, and then they pivot and kind of like gloss over that stuff. And they're like, we're not going to talk about how we used to recommend that.
Yeah.
They're doing it now. I just want to point out they're doing it now with this launch of passages, where the first iteration of their communication talked about it as indexing, and then the next one talked about it as ranking, and all the SEOs are like locked into this, like, is it indexing or is it ranking? We really need to know. And to me, like, I've been saying that the indexing of Fraggles is what I've called them since 2018. Are actually passages. I've been saying that is mobile first indexing. The idea behind mobile first indexing is the ability to not just index one page at a time, but index one thing at a time, even if it's within a page. And so what Google's saying now with passages just this week is they're indexed separately but together as part of the page, right? That's their middle ground of it. Is it separate indexing or is it not? Or is it ranking? Is it something else? They haven't nailed this communication for the nuanced SEOs that just live and die on every word.
So right now, the whole idea of passages, there isn't necessarily something we should be doing, or is there something that actually we should be thinking about right now?
Yeah, absolutely. You should have been thinking about it 2 years ago. It's actually been going on. They just didn't announce it. Google rolls these things out and does tests for years at a time before they announce it. And usually they're midway through perfecting it when they announce it. They're like, this is good enough for us to talk about, but they're still fine-tuning it. And usually when they roll it out, things go wrong, right? Like, we've been having indexing problems for the past 2 or 3 months. Why? Because they're messing with the index, right? And they're messing with the index for passages, and they've turned off the request indexing button in Search Console. Why? Because they're messing with the index. And they had passages probably rolled out for a small section, and they weren't calling them anything. They didn't have a name except for what I was calling them, which was Fraggles. And now they've probably just changed the setting and opened it up much wider, and that's going to cause some more problems that they have to fix. And I think they're used to this process now. But I think we're going to continue to see indexing problems for the next at least 2 months as they work through the issues that come with heavier indexing of passages. / I think they should be called Fraggles, and Google should adopt my word.
Yeah, I know. I was going to say I'm really disappointed they didn't use Fraggles, but oh well, they've missed out.
Well, in Fraggles, there's a reason. Passages is like, but Fraggles is fragment plus handle, which means that there's a fragment jump link that goes to a specific part of a page. I invented it, but I'm just going to say it's kind of brilliant.
Yeah, let's call them Fraggles then from now on. Okay, let's continue with that. So what should I be doing now to take advantage of Fraggles?
Right. So we've seen the indexing and ranking of Fraggles go up and down and be presented a lot of different ways. The thing that seems to work most is, number one, to have a highly ordered page that has Fraggle size kind of paragraphs or sections or bullets, and then use your heading tags really well. H1, H2, and they need to be only one H1, H2s within the H1, H3s within the H2s, so that it's super duper ordered and easy for Google to understand. We tend to use a lot of speakable schema. That helps too, because when Google talks about passages, they talk about Q&A, they talk about questions. So we use a lot of FAQ schema, a lot of how-to schema, a lot of Q&A schema. And we'll go a step further sometimes and add a jump link for Google. But the important part about passages and Fraggles is that Google can find and link to the content without that jump link. The jump link just helps them.
And so is there any types of content that are more likely to appear as Fraggles?
Yeah, the speakable stuff. So questions, FAQ, how to. And if you think about Fraggles, let's back up for a second. Why would Google want Fraggles? Number one, they've doubled down and invested loads of money in their connected home and assistant. And what would be the worst experience you can imagine on a Google Assistant? Them reading you the entire web page.
Yeah.
Right? So if they can find the actual answer to your question and just read you that passage, brilliant. Right? And this is why they're also asking people now to put the bookmarks in their YouTube videos. And if you can't do it already, I haven't read the updates on podcasting, but if you can't do it already, they will be asking you to do it in podcasts, probably. Put bookmarks to different topics. But the thing with podcasts is they're transcribing everything. So they're looking for the keywords that you and I are speaking to rank podcast passages as well.
Okay, let's drop some keywords then. And so like local marketing podcast, local SEO podcast.
Cindy Krum.
So part of me, it makes me a little sad sometimes when I see, Google's launching these kind of things. I've got a background in content writing and, craft this piece of content and you really think, I'm going to structure this really well. So, I'm doing some storytelling. I'm covering all the important points. And then Google's effectively going, this is the only thing that matters. I'm going to jump straight to it. Is this just what we're going to have to live with as we go forward?
To some degree, yes. And it's worse than you think, actually, because you craft this beautiful thing. And what we saw when Google was doing the AMP featured snippets, I don't know if you've seen these, but with AMP featured snippets, the featured snippet from an AMP page was showing up like a featured snippet at the top, and when you clicked through, they were highlighting the answer that they had showed you, but Google was adding ellipses, and when you saw the highlighting, they were literally skipping sentences, going, this is fluff, you don't need this. Answer part one, answer part two, and filling in the ... They're not even exact quoting you. They're chopping things up. They're not bad at it. They're pretty good at it. All of the language, natural language learning that they've done and BERT and stuff like that, all of that is feeding into this. But I think that if you're writing long form content, you've made this great story, blah, 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 you have to now actually be more targeted with it and say, is this long form content even appropriate in a voice search? Do we want it to rank for Fraggles or not? Do we want this to be consumed, cut up or not? And maybe you don't. But the other thing is to think about stories differently, because if you have long form content that tells a really rich story, what Google wants you to do is web stories, because those are super easy to parse because they have slides, so they're already parsed. It's like a parsed video podcast thing with text. It's this multi-modal experience meant to tell a story that Google wants to rank.
So we should always be really thinking kind of how we approach content marketing or writing content in general. But in some instances, it's not just about trying to optimize for the certain thing for the Fraggle. It's about actually what is the content trying to achieve then.
Yeah, what's the use case? But in general, Fraggles are actually, you have to give Google credit because they're useful. They do help UX. If there's a long page, I don't want, and I asked a very simple question, I don't want to read the whole page. And so the user might be more likely to convert if they go from the SERP to the answer. If the answer is something I can buy or interact with, they won't get lost. It might be a tighter funnel that keeps people in.
Yeah, tell you what, I could do with it for recipe blogs where you just want to find out how to make the cake rather than hearing the life story. Just tell me how many eggs.
That's exactly, like, Google created that problem and now they're trying to fix it by going, thanks for writing all that crap. We don't need it anymore. Or we know users don't need it anymore.
Yeah.
But that's a response to Google. You know, the cooks don't love to write. They love to cook. But they did that so their recipes would rank.
Definitely. Maybe there will be a change. Maybe people will realize that, it's not about having 1,000 words before the content that people actually want, just because there's this sense that longer equals more likely to rank. It's actually, let's just really benefit the user, the reader, and focus on that most.
Well, and when you think about the larger implications of this change to indexing, it actually is quite monumental because it blurs the line between how we normally think about SEO in terms of ranking a page. Now we're ranking potentially a piece of a page. And when that's the case, if the lines between, this is a page and this is a piece of a page, do we want to rank the whole page or just the piece? That makes all of the definitions a bit more blurry. And I think that what we're going to see is a lot more emphasis on authoritative stuff and the authority of the domain. This is where EAT comes in, I think, a little bit, to say, should this piece rank at all? What are the global ranking signals around it to tell us, should it rank? And so it's not just the page lending it SEO value. It's the page and the entire domain and the context in which the domain is in and what authority it has on what topics.
So let's go back to mobile marketing. Would you say that most businesses just aren't even thinking about it? I can imagine a lot of businesses these days have got a responsive website. And I can imagine that's not enough. Am I right?
I mean, for some companies it is. But a lot of companies that are bigger aren't thinking about it right. And a lot of SEOs are thinking about mobile first indexing in a really simplified way. I think that one of the things that concerns me the most, or that troubles me the most about the SEO industry is it's turned from the old days, even before mobile was a thing. But in the early days of SEO, we were really doing a lot of figuring out and testing. And now there's so many more SEOs, but it's become this like groupthink thing where they kind of wait for Google to spoon feed them what they need to do. And I think that Google has official things that they can say, but they're not here to help us game their algorithm. And so with mobile first indexing, Google said, we're doing this thing called mobile first indexing, and what really matters is that you're responsive and that the things match between the desktop experience and the mobile experience. And that's it, don't worry. And if you're desktop only and you don't care about mobile, that's fine with us. And now they've switched and they've said, boop, no more desktop only, everything's going to be mobile first indexing. And no one's talking about that, like, this is a shift. This is a change to what they've said. But you could have seen it coming if you thought about why. Why is Google doing this? What is the point? And Google kept talking, when mobile first indexing launched, all they talked about was the crawler. But they called it mobile first indexing. So it's got to also be about indexing. So it's not just that the mobile crawler is getting different things, because actually Google had been crawling with the smartphone crawler as the primary crawler for a long time. This is something that people forget. They made the smartphone crawler the primary crawler a while ago, before they launched mobile first indexing, but they were still crawling with the desktop too. When they launched mobile first indexing, they kind of doubled down and said, no, the smartphone crawler is the crawler. And then advanced and they said, okay, evergreen crawler, yay. Evergreen crawler is where they said the smartphone crawler is always going to keep up with the version of Chrome that we're on, which is a big deal. But these are pivots, right? These are changes along the way that if you watch what they do, you can really understand and think about why they would do it. There's more to know. And you can be prepared a lot faster if you don't just wait for Google to spoon feed you what to do. Rant over, sorry.
No, rant away. So what would be an example of a problem that one of your larger enterprise clients would come to you with when it comes to mobile SEO or mobile marketing?
Yeah, so one of the big food delivery companies came to us, and what we found out was that they weren't handling mobile first crawling and indexing correctly. And it was at the time closer to after mobile first indexing had just launched, where there was a week-long delay between the first crawl, which was desktop bot, basically no JavaScript or less JavaScript, and then mobile bot would come in and render things, and that's another big difference in mobile, is it's rendered. So there were two phases of crawling and index, or two phases of indexing, I should say, but it's really crawling and indexing because it's the different bots. So two phases, and they were sending different title tags from the non-rendered part of the site because they were using JavaScript to write their title tags and meta descriptions. And the JavaScript wasn't getting executed in the first pass of the crawler, but it was getting indexed as the unoptimized standard issue in every HTML page, title tag, meta description. And in some cases, we found out other content was missing because they were using JavaScript to populate the whole page. The whole site was just an app that was populated by the server. And so that was causing them lots of problems because they had to do a good job for their customers, because they had a lot of different customers. The customers were the restaurants, the customers were the people ordering the food. To do a good job for the restaurant customers, they had to get their stuff indexed quickly to start driving traffic and driving orders for those restaurants. But with this, we were sending mismatched metadata. It was confusing the bot. Sometimes the bot didn't always switch over to the new, better metadata. And so the page wouldn't have a good chance to rank. So that's a really clear example of what you might miss.
Okay, so a lot of the times people are coming to you with problems. Now, say you fix a lot of those problems. Is it a case that that's all you do for the clients, or is there ongoing stuff in mobile SEO that businesses should actually be doing?
Well, with mobile SEO, there's ongoing stuff in the same way that there is ongoing stuff for regular SEO. Once we've got all of the tech issues fixed, which can take a while because mobile is more technical than desktop, once we've got all that fixed, then we do look at things in a more block and tackle content strategy way. But often the content strategy goes with other kind of mobile oriented things, like we would be thinking of what's our content strategy for getting some Fraggles and seeing if they convert for us better? Or what's our content strategy for getting more featured snippets or getting more people also ask? And then there's also stuff where we look at the SERP in a much more holistic way, where we're saying, what can we do to improve our knowledge graph? What can we do to improve all of the other things? Do we need to be in interesting finds? Are there other things that come into a Google result that take up so much space that we could do? Because in mobile, obviously it's tactile because you're touching the result, but when you compare mobile results to the desktop results, there's actually a lot more images that are included, or in a mobile search result that wouldn't be included in the same desktop result. So we're looking at that going, okay, so we don't, none of the tools are telling us that we have this image or that our competitor has this image, but I bet that is driving more clicks because it's a really great image. So we do more looking at actual results. And there are other things, like none of the tools, except Mobile Moxie tool is working on it, but none of the tools are reporting on Fraggles. Most of them, like skip over things like site links unless you're in position 1, but there are now site links happening all over. So we're looking for those extra juicy things that people are missing on desktop.
Yeah. So would you say that mobile needs its own strategy and approach when you're thinking about an SEO strategy, or does it just now need to take up a much bigger chunk?
Well, so there was a big discussion yesterday actually on Twitter about, is mobile SEO different from desktop SEO? And I would still maintain that it is in some ways, but that it's table stakes now and you can't skip it. You must be doing at least bare minimum mobile SEO because Google's about to drop the desktop crawler. Everything's going to be mobile first indexing. And what that means in a larger view is that Google is going to use this new ability to index different bits and pieces of the web in a different way. And I think that what you see with some very specific kinds of results is going to be much more widespread. So right now in Google, if you do a search for anything related to coronavirus, you're going to get a very rich result with graphs that have drop downs where you can change the graph or change the axis or change the location. And then you have local government information about it and local stats and pictures and all these things and links to related topics. And it's not a knowledge graph, but it takes as much space as a knowledge graph. And maybe it is a knowledge graph, it feels like it's from the knowledge graph, but it's not wrapped in the traditional knowledge graph thing, but it's clearly a topic or an entity. So Google calls entity understanding like the topic layer. And I think what happens is things bubble up from the web layer to the topic layer and get combined in a richer result. So I think that's how Fraggles and how mobile first indexing and the switch away from the desktop crawler is going to get us to a whole new place that is potentially much harder to rank because Google is creating these really rich interactive experiences at the top of the page that users will love.
So you mentioned entity understanding. I'm going to hold my hands up. Not something I know a huge amount about. So explain it to me. What is entity understanding?
I love talking about entity understanding because SEOs are much more prone than regular people to not understand it, believe it or not, because SEOs live and die on keywords, right? And keywords are language specific, and they're words that have specific meanings. But entities are a step back from a word. And this actually baffled me the first time I heard about semantic understanding and stuff like this. But if you think about the concept, this is my go-to example. If you think about the concept of what it is to be a mother or a father, that concept does not change regardless of what language we're speaking, right? A mother has children, has parents, might have a husband, right? These relationships are maintained regardless of whether we're saying mother in English or German or Japanese, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that mother concept and its relationships is the entity. So it's the relationships to other entities that make an entity a thing that is language agnostic. Do you follow?
Yes. Yeah, I get it.
So let me bend your mind a little bit more. Right when Google was launching mobile first indexing, it was super weird that John Mueller kept talking about hreflang. And everyone's like, but we want to hear about mobile first indexing. He's like, I want to talk about hreflang. It's because mobile first indexing, the indexing of Fraggles and passages, is entity first indexing. And when they have good hreflang, not only can they understand when things should rank in what language, but they can understand entities better because they can build out the connections and they can understand those connections in every language. And something that Google struggled with for years is that they're great at English, but they're less good at other languages. And they're especially less good at understanding, like machine understanding, smaller languages that have low volume of searches and interactions, because they're looking for high volume of interactions to validate their understanding. a woman I work with is Bulgarian. And so this helps a lot because that's a really small language. And it's not understood. It's not one of the ones that Google claims to understand. So we compare, how does Google understand this query when it's translated directly into Bulgarian, really small language, when it's translated into something Google claims it understands, like Spanish or Hindi, and when it's in English. And when they have entity understanding, they can build out their understanding of other languages based on the entity relationships rather than actually manually learning the language.
So with entity understanding, this is Google just trying to get better at understanding what things are, or is this actually something that we can take advantage of?
I think it's both. But I think you have to open your mind to what is our job, right? Because the need to understand a query in every language comes from Google's desire to do a good job at their job, which is ranking the right answer. Especially think about if Google can't understand a written query very well, or the intent of a written query, they're going to struggle even more in voice. Because voice is harder to process, they might not get every word. But if they roll it back to an entity understanding and have a really rich understanding of the entity, they can fake it. So for instance, if I do a query for who was the drummer in the Cranberries, okay? Let's say I do that query in Bulgarian. So the truth is the Cranberries didn't have a drummer. But Google's going to show the knowledge graph for the Cranberries, the band. I'm going to be able to poke around and look for the drummer, and it'll say artists, and I'll click on artists and be like, there's no drummer here. Oh, maybe they didn't have a drummer. And I'll read the snippet, and they'll say, Cranberries was a band of 3 people, a guitarist, da, 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 da. I don't know much about the Cranberries, honestly, but maybe they had more than 3 people. But they fake it because they found the entity, and they showed the knowledge graph for that entity. And they didn't actually answer your question in a direct way with a name because they couldn't, but they rolled back a step and said, we can make you feel good about this answer, even though it's not an exact answer.
So Google's making a pretty good guess at what feels relevant, even if it can't fully understand what the answer should be.
Yeah.
So let's say I have a Cranberries fan website. I'm absolutely obsessed, and I know that people will search who the drummer is, and I've created a dedicated page. Am I going to lose out now because Google's actually put in an entity there? Or is it just the case that Google's filling the gaps where they don't actually have a web page that provides that answer?
It's a really good question, and I don't know the answer. What I do know is I have seen they're testing knowledge graph not ranking number 1. So potentially, maybe you get the featured snippet and your featured snippet displaces the knowledge graph, or you get quoted in the artist section of the knowledge graph, because I think something that Google's going to have to do, and I think it's part of EAT as well, they're going to have to start quoting sites that are not Wikipedia, because Wikipedia is it's not the only place where we get information. But something else that helps with the idea, it helps back this idea of entity understanding, is that Google is actually translating Wikipedia when Wikipedia isn't available in the language that you're searching in. And Google is matching the knowledge graph result to the language setting on your phone. So this is one thing that we play with a lot. Even if you're in the United States, if you change your language setting to Spanish, something in the Cloud Natural Language API, you change it to Spanish, but you search in English, the knowledge graph is going to come back in Spanish, but the rest of the results will be in English because they're doing keyword matching, whereas knowledge graph is doing entity matching, and it's trying to adapt to the language preference that your phone is sending.
So when I have heard about entity understanding previously, and I've learned way more, thanks to the Cranberries, that's a good example, I've always viewed it as more of related to the idea of zero-click searches and the idea that actually Google just wants to serve up the answers in the search results page. Is that true? Is that actually a play from Google, or is that just a consequence?
Yep, it's totally, Google wants to keep you in the Googleverse that they've monetized rather than send you anywhere else, unless they're sure that your website has exactly what they need and that their stuff doesn't. But Google's got to make money. They've got to pay bills too. So they're trying to keep people engaged on their website, just like we're trying to keep people engaged on ours.
Yeah. So what do you think are the biggest risks for SEOs or businesses when it comes to these changes that are happening either around mobile first indexing or entity understanding?
It's a huge risk, I think. I think you make an excellent point that zero-click search potentially hurts SEOs and webmasters. To stay relevant, to maintain traffic, we have to adjust. And that means doing the things that are going to get pulled into these zero-click searches. So that means getting featured snippets, getting people also ask, getting interesting finds, and doing things like web stories, doing things like videos. This is the secret, that a lot of people don't know, is the non-standard web stuff, the stuff that's not a straight-up blue link, races to the top of a lot of queries. Even like simple things, like we've found out that LinkedIn, in our tool, since we do the percent of page, you can take up between 4 and 12%, 11 or 12% of a SERP just by having different tweets in the past 5 minutes or in the past hour or whatever, because some of the tweets that are just tweets that rank, or it's just your profile, sometimes it's like a middle size. So knowing what ranks, which social media ranks well because it's engaging and is more engaging depending on what you're doing, right? The most engaging one has massive multiple pictures and some text and your Twitter profile name, and I think even your Twitter profile picture, super rich result. So just knowing how the presentation of things change in the search result, and not just like hammering home on the blue links for your website, but opening your eyes to a multifaceted approach where you're saying, oh, well, I've worked so hard to get this blue link that takes up only 4% of the page and ranks here, but all I had to do was send out that information in a tweet with a bunch of pictures, and darn if it doesn't rank number 1 and take up a bunch of space and look really cool.
I think it's also quite exciting because so much of SEO has been focused on keywords, on written content, and then all of a sudden there are these new opportunities. And I can imagine a lot of SEOs previously hadn't thought video was a big thing. Maybe there were some SEOs who were looking at how to rank high on YouTube, but now it's like, well, actually, how to rank high on Google, and a video strategy can actually get you there.
Absolutely. And I talk about it as cutting in line. Jumping the queue, right? Like you just get to the front.
I also do have this fear that we'll just see loads of spammy videos, and there'll just be video production farms that are chucking out anything that they can do to try and get a snippet for any keyword.
They are. And actually I am. We're doing a test. We're doing a test with a video glossary of SEO terms to see if we could displace or rank with the definitions, like when you search for what is CTR or something like that. We've made a bunch of really short videos of me just explaining vocab words for SEO to see. So that's not super spammy, but we'll see if it can rank. It's not ranking. I need to check in on it. But stuff like that, I think you're right. Like that, there might be a whole new brand of spam. A lot of companies are actually using AI to mass generate videos.
Yeah.
Have you seen these? So like, let's say we have a list of 100 different, types of pipe fittings or something silly. You could take that and put it into a program that'll generate a 30-second video on this pipe fitting and why plumbers need it. As long as you put the text in and the picture, and then it adds in other pictures and stuff like that. Bam. I think that's a whole new potential for spam, but it also a whole new potential for really great stuff, because if you're a plumber, maybe that's exactly what you wanted, was that pipe fitting video.
Yeah, I have a friend who works at a company called Synthesia Technologies, and it's a bit of AI technology which effectively generates people, like they're not real people, and you can plug in what you want them to say and they'll be there on screen just saying it.
Yeah.
And that I can see is, I don't know, I'm a bit worried about that, because obviously there's the whole deep fake idea, you know, false information, but I can also see people just going in and going, brilliant, let's just chuck a load of content and spit out loads and loads of videos. We don't have to pay for a camera, we don't have to get a talent, we don't have to make sure that we've got great lighting. We can just put some text into this bit of technology and get loads and loads of videos out. So I can see all kinds of ways for this to be abused in the future.
Take it a step further. I was tweeting with the guy from Google who created Web Stories, because he was doing an AMA. And my question was, what's the interaction of Web Stories and chatbots on something like a Google Home? And what you're talking about could also be a chatbot, right? Where you ask it a question and it goes through a tree of what it knows to answer, and it gives you the answer, and then it continues. And you could do something like that with Web Stories as well. And his answer, the guy from Google is like, well, I'm not allowed to really announce anything, but that's a really fun question, right? Kind of tipping his hand a little bit, going, yeah, that might be where things are going. And I do think a lot of things will go towards interactive chatbots, because that's another kind of engagement.
Definitely. I think we should always come at these things with an open mind, because ultimately we're trying to deliver a good experience. We're trying to deliver the right content. We're trying to help people solve problems or answer questions. And there's not one right way to do that. We should always come at it in the idea that these new advancements or these new changes present opportunity, rather than just taking away something that we're already doing.
Exactly. And think about younger generations, because they are so much less likely to actually pick up a phone and call a company with a question. It's not even crossing their mind. They'll open the app, they'll do an online chat. They might, small percent might send an email, but they're more likely to send a tweet to the company.
So let's say I'm going into the office on Monday, and this is the wake-up call I needed on mobile first indexing. What should I be doing?
Well, number one, listening to this podcast is a good start. Number two, Mobile Moxie has a channel of all of the presentations I've done at every conference since the beginning of 2019. So that's a good way to get up to speed. You can just put them on in the back while you're working. If you want to be great at it, we're looking at things that Google is doing for non-SEO groups, because that stuff usually filters into SEO. So we're looking at what they're doing for apps, what they're doing for Google Music and books and YouTube and stuff like that. But I think the basic stuff is, listen to some of my talks, because I'm saying things that most other people aren't saying. I think the reason I'm able to predict things like passages 2 years in advance is I look at the bigger picture and think about, why is Google doing this? And how are they going to make money on this? How are they going to improve a user experience on this? And think about Google as a business that has to make money too. So what would you do if you were Google? Or if you were Google, why would you be doing this? And that helps change perspectives a lot, and it helps you kind of read between the lines in any of the announcements. And then beyond that, beyond just educating yourself, I would say use all the tools that are available, especially the free ones. Use the mobile-friendly test and read every single word in the response. Use the URL inspection tool and read every word. And then use Search Console and be like, wow, look at all these new things that they're giving us in Search Console. If it's important enough to get into new Search Console, it's probably important. So the things like schema, hugely important for entity understanding and for getting better, more visual rankings in a SERP. And lo and behold, there are entire pages in New Search Console for the different kinds of schema to tell you how you're doing. If they're reporting on it, it's not just important to you, it's important to them and their algorithm.
Yeah, definitely. If it's there, there's a reason.
Well, and also if it's not there, there's a reason. Let's talk about Search Console not telling us when a knowledge graph result is pushing position 1 down 30% of the page, or when a map pack is pushing position 1. Like, I know we're talking to local SEOs and they love that map pack, but why is Search Console not able to tell us when our map pack is in the rankings and where it is? Like, maybe they're making money because we don't know, because we're in the dark. And maybe they're afraid, like, we would riot if we knew how much space Google would take up, or Google's already taking up on some of these queries. Maybe not riot, SEOs are peaceful people, but protest.
So you've made some good predictions over the years. I mean, the fact that you were talking about what was eventually responsive web design back in 2005. You got Fraggles, spot on. What's your prediction for, let's say, the next 2 years? What should we be keeping an eye out for?
It's cross-device, and that sounds like an old term, but think cross-device in a much bigger way. So Fraggles are fantastic because you can show them on a phone, on a desktop, on a connected home device with a screen. It can read it to you without a screen. You can yell, hey assistant, I'm not going to trigger mine, but you can yell, hey assistant, to your car, and it can answer your questions. And if you haven't been testing stuff like that, you should be, because that's a whole new ranking potential. In the same way that mobile was additive. So when people started doing mobile searches, it didn't actually really cannibalize desktop in the beginning. It was additive. Okay, and additive in screen time as well. So before mobile phones, we were on the computer at this times of day, and that was it. And then we added mobile phones, and now we're on the computer this time of day, and mobile phones here and here and maybe here, and it expanded the amount of time and opportunity you had to reach a potential client. So that's what's going to happen with Fraggles and cross-device stuff, is if you do it well, you're going to further expand your reach, because you're going to be available when someone's cooking and they yell, hey assistant, or when someone's driving and they yell, hey assistant, where they previously wouldn't have been able to because their hands were otherwise, driving or cooking. Or think about the idea of the connected TV. In the same way that we don't remember phone numbers anymore, but as a kid we knew all our best friends' phone numbers by heart, but now we don't have to because the phone remembers it for us. Now with connected TVs and voice-operated remotes, you can just say, watch CNN or what sports are on today, and the system will tell you. So it focuses much more on marketing as a hard skill that's existed forever, and not technical tricks so much. Like, you get the technical tricks, but then what you're doing is marketing brand awareness and those kinds of things, not trying to trick someone into converting.
Okay, so it's no longer cross devices, mobile, tablet, and desktop. There's a whole world out there. And that's coming in a big way soon then.
Yeah, and that's what Google's been doubling down on. That's what they think is coming, and I think that they're right. And I think that you just have to think about it as an opportunity, different opportunities to show up in different experiences. So things like podcasts are great because, number one, I think Google will be slicing and dicing podcasts as answers. So if you ask the question, what year did Mobile Moxie start? And I answer it, then they can see this as a question and answer, because most podcasts are actually question and answer. That's how they work. And podcasts are a great solution for a response that doesn't have a screen. So videos aren't a great solution there, but podcasts are. And why do we think Google doubled down on podcasts and redid their podcast platform a year and a half ago? Because they needed to be able to start indexing them better, parsing them up, ranking them in carousels, because podcast rankings are changing too. So ranking them as an entity and a unit. This is the podcast. This is the episode of the podcast. And this is a Fraggle within the podcast.
I'm glad to hear podcasts are going to be more important, because now I can say this podcast is not just a brand building exercise, it's an SEO exercise. So boom.
Everything's an SEO exercise now.
Brilliant. So each time we ask our guest 2 questions, and this is about imparting some advice onto our listeners. So the first one is, what one skill should marketers focus on in the next 1 to 2 years to really develop their careers?
Something I'm focusing on is trying to learn more about JavaScript, because I think that there's a massive merge happening between web and app, and Google wants to blur the line between web and app. And then, of course, there's web apps, which are primarily JavaScript, and Google's getting better at JavaScript. So I think we all need to get better at JavaScript and understanding how it works, how to optimize it, stuff like that. So I would focus on that. And there are some JavaScript SEO experts that are fantastic. Bartosz comes to mind, and Onely. The whole company is good at it. Let's see, that's one. The other skill I would say is just curiosity. And I'm going to say curiosity plus. And what I mean with curiosity plus is the exercise that I go through a lot when I have these revelations. I'm like, oh, that makes so much sense. There's no reason they wouldn't do that. It's curiosity plus storytelling, where I say Google's doing this and this and this. If I had to tell a story about why these things were happening all at the same time, what would it be? And you make up the story, and you're like, does that make sense? Is that right? Or what if it's this story? And so it's curiosity plus storytelling plus questioning. I guess it's what I just described as critical thinking. You need critical thinking skills. You need to critically evaluate what you're seeing, and not always take things for granted that you're just told, not always believe everything that you're told.
Yeah. I can imagine that it's easy or even tempting to not really approach SEO with that level of critical thinking that might have been needed 15 or 20 years ago when there wasn't much out there, right? It was about experimentation. And actually, it's a common theme in this podcast is that when you don't know what you need to do, you're really motivated to try and figure out, and you start experimenting. But because there's so much information out there, and like you said, the groupthink, it's basically people just approaching it in the same way and not actually thinking about what Google might be doing or what Google actually might be saying.
This is a perfect example for this podcast. Mike Blumenthal did a test that he launched yesterday, or that he wrote up and published yesterday, about optimizing the GMB website for a company. And he said, doing a couple of things, it actually ranked really well without links. Does that surprise me? No, because that is part of Google's knowledge graph.
Yeah.
But SEOs have been writing off the GMB websites going, oh, it's just for people who aren't, savvy enough to put together their own website. No, you're feeding Google information into their platform. They're going to use it.
So the final question is, what advice would you give to someone who is entering marketing or SEO today?
A question that I get asked a lot from SEOs is around, how do I become a speaker? So I think I want to answer that question, if that's okay with you.
Yeah, brilliant. I'd love to hear.
If you're new to SEO and you want to become a speaker, number 1, don't be afraid to try. Number 2, especially don't be afraid to try. Women and minorities are in just every conference is looking to diversify. And so, don't be afraid to just stand up and say, I have something to say, or I can explain this really well. And, when I started speaking, I didn't think of myself as a mobile SEO expert, but there was this conference that was going to be canceled if they couldn't find a speaker on the topic. And I was like, well, I've been researching it. and I could tell you what I found. And that's all it took, where I told people what I found, and they hadn't been researching it. So it was all new, and they were so impressed. And I was like, it was just a little bit of research, so the bar isn't as high as you think, especially if you're specializing. And so that's the real advice, is don't be afraid, but also don't be afraid to specialize, and don't be afraid to say, this is what I've found. And it might not match with the groupthink, and it might not be what everyone else is looking at, but I'm looking at this and it's interesting, and that's fine. And that's that is another trick to let you cut in line, where if you're talking about something that no one else is talking about, you have no competition. And if you're researching something that no one else is researching, there are fewer people to get up and tell you you're wrong.
Yeah.
And my perspective when I first got on my very first stage in talking about mobile SEO was just that, like, I'm going to say what I found and what I think. And if someone tells me I'm wrong, that's great, because I'll learn something. And so that's kind of the mental gymnastics you have to do to say, this is going to be fine. I'm just going to do this thing. If you go for mainstream and you say, I'm going to talk about keyword research, well, everyone can talk about keyword research. So you have to talk about special keyword research, or it has to be like next level keyword research. And then you have a much easier time getting noticed than just going for what everyone's going for.
Brilliant advice. Awesome. Well, Cindy, it's been a really insightful conversation. It's probably been the podcast that has challenged me the most in terms of understanding an aspect of SEO. So thanks for putting me up to that challenge, and it's been brilliant having you on.
Thank you so much.
So that's it for this episode of Adventures in Local Marketing. As I said, Cindy has a great way of explaining the very technical in a very easy to understand way. And I definitely learned a lot during that conversation. There may be hope for me yet as a technical SEO. Now, this podcast is a great starting point, but I recommend going away and reading up on some of the topics that we spoke about today. To get you started, I've dropped some links in the show notes, so I recommend going to check those out. I'm going to leave it there for today, but I have one more quick request. I'd love to hear your feedback about the show. And the easiest way to do that is to head to Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen and leave us a review. I'll read every single one and take all of the feedback on board. And of course, those reviews also help us get in front of more local marketers. So any reviews are greatly appreciated. I'll catch you again very soon. Thanks for listening.